And just a reminder that Radio 4's programme Waterlines tomorrow evening will be looking at the current state of Britain's leisure craft industry as a new Canadian boat is to be built over here, and also why Australians are gathering in Cornwall. Waterlines with Cliff Mitchell-Moore on Radio 4 at 6:30 tomorrow evening. On BBC One in about 10 minutes, a look at animal behaviour in the Horizon film What Makes an Animal Smart. And here on BBC2 now, it's time for Newsnight.
Supporters of Ulster MP Peter Robinson run a gauntlet of fire in the Irish Republic. But did this violent reception add fuel to the Loyalist campaign? Good evening. The Loyalist supporters of Ian Paisley and Peter Robinson are petrol-bombed in the Irish Republic, then accused of bringing violence and thuggery across the border. We'll have a full account of today's events from Belfast to Dundalk, and I'll be asking a former Attorney General in the Republic if the Loyalists may have been handed a propaganda gift by those who attacked them. Also, the cruel paradox of unemployment, as high wages for those in work threaten to drive up still further the record number of those out of a job. Employment Minister Kenneth Clarke gives the government's response.
As violence breaks out in Pakistan, the opposition leader Benazir Bhutto is tonight under arrest in Karachi, only 4 months after her return to the country. We ask one of her father's former senior civil servants where the confrontation between her and President Zia will end. The United States Senate prepares to approve sanctions against South Africa. The presidential contender, Jesse Jackson, tells us why President Reagan will have to bow to pressure from Congress. And we've a full roundup of news at home and abroad.
Almost a week after the Ulster Loyalist invasion of the southern Irish village of Clontibret, 150 unionists made another foray across the border today in support of their leader Ian Paisley and his deputy Peter Robinson. Mr. Robinson was going to make an appearance in an Irish court in Dundalk to hear charges against him arising from the Clontibret incident. That was designed to illustrate alleged deficiencies in cross-border security. After the court hearing today, the Loyalists were attacked by petrol bombs in Dundalk, a strongly Republican town. And later, the acting Justice Minister in Southern Ireland, Michael Noonan, condemned Mr. Paisley and Mr. Robinson for bringing what he called their violence and thuggery across the border. Gavin Estler followed today's Loyalist incursion.
And the Lord said, I am with thee, and will bring thee again into this land. Quoting the biblical promise of divine protection, the MP for East Belfast, Peter Robinson, today set out to cross into what for him is enemy territory. He put more faith in God than in the Irish police.
No, I have a greater power looking after me than the Garda.
A few miles south of the Irish border, the town of Dundalk was making ready to meet him, with 1,000 members of the Garda Síochána specially drafted in and prepared for the worst. There were those who, with unfathomable logic, were repairing their windows before the Loyalists arrived. Those who viewed the invasion in prospect with alarm, and a few determined not to miss any opportunity presented by the imminent arrival of the world's media.
It's hard to know what to expect because we've never had it from that section of the community apart from football matches before. That's really it, but that's been at night time, so a daytime scene is something unusual here, you know.
But no football crowd needs Ireland's army to be put on alert, and while the politicians and their lawyers passed south across the Irish border unhindered, their supporters were stopped and searched. Irish police confiscated combat jackets and anything which appeared likely to be an offensive weapon, including the flagpoles belonging to one Democratic Unionist politician.
I expect us to wave our flags. We have no intention of causing any trouble, but we need the poles.
You can keep your flags.
It's a disgrace. Would you fly a checker? Would you fly a checker without a pole?
You can collect the flags on the poles on the way back.
Would you fly a checker without a pole? This isn't any provocation. This is out to cause trouble.
By this time, Peter Robinson was already being taken through a side entrance to Dundalk Courthouse. His case came up after a couple of minor driving offences, and he was remanded on bail until October. But outside there were those who hoped he would suffer the full rigour of Irish law.
What should happen to him?
Hang him. If it was anybody else, they'd be above in jail till it's trial.
A few hundred yards away, on the other side of police lines, the small northern contingent had arrived and treated Dundalk to songs which are not usually favourites in the town. As the 2-minute court appearance ended, the Democratic Unionist politicians decided the opportunity to make even more political capital was too good to miss.
The amazing thing of this appearance is that both our cars were attacked coming in. One of the doors of the cars is a bit stamped in. And when this was raised by our solicitor, the justice said it was no concern of his. I find that an amazing statement. I don't understand the laws of the Irish Republic, but I know that in the North or in any British court, the judge would be absolutely concerned that a prisoner would have safe conduct to and from a court, and it would be his duty to see that that happens.
Politicians, particularly unionist politicians, are under threat at any time. The Irish Republican Army has active service units in this town. The Irish Republican Army has killers in this town. So undoubtedly there is a threat there. Right. The state allows those killers to remain here. It won't extradite them. I think we saw a fiasco in the courts in this land very recently, as you're well aware. So I think there undoubtedly is danger, but we're prepared to face that danger. And,
Will you be answering
as Ulster loyalists, we're not going to run from the IRA or anyone else.
But as Ian Paisley and Peter Robinson prepared to leave, their supporters were finding things more difficult. Some held clothes over their heads to protect themselves from stones and bottles, but neither that nor the riot squad was sufficient to shield them from what was to come. 2 crates of petrol bombs were thrown from a second-floor window, and more missiles rained down on the loyalists. Amazingly, no one was seriously injured, but some who were cut and bruised blamed the Irish police for not rescuing them.
The Garda got themselves behind the barriers to protect themselves. That's right. And they left the Republicans flanking each side of the street in Dundalk, while the Protestants were in the centre, totally defenceless. We asked for protection from the Garda to do something about it, that there's likely to be trouble from the Republicans. They didn't do it. They ignored us. Then about 10 minutes later, the Republicans attacked the loyalist people, and the Garda then stood back and did nothing.
But police with truncheons did quickly wade into local youths, cleared the streets and made 7 arrests. Despite the trouble and the prospect of further mayhem when Peter Robinson is due in court again in October, police commanders were content they had handled the day well.
I am aware of the fact that petrol bombs were thrown. I don't know the circumstances which it happened. All I can tell you is that there are a number of people in custody at the moment. I can't say any more than that about that point.
Of course, this was simply a couple of hundred loyalists who came into town today. What happens?
I would say even less. I would say even less. Probably 150 at most.
But if next time they come with bigger support, will you be able to handle it?
Well, it's our job to look after the security situation, and we will do so.
Will you turn them back at the border?
I prefer not to give any details of how we would operate on any given date.
Did you turn any of them back at the border?
We didn't turn anybody back today. We didn't turn anybody away. I understand there was some complaint that people were delayed, but that they obviously came too late. It was no part of our tactic to delay anybody. We did have car searches, but that was a security measure.
The loyalists had one final hurdle to cross. They had to get out of Dundalk, and they were, in effect, run out of town, their cars attacked, their windows smashed. Some felt the cost to the town made the court case against Peter Robinson a political mistake.
It's not worth pursuing it, in my opinion, but if I were to give expression to the feeling of the majority of people in the South, it would be that they should have, in the first instance, been charged under the the Offences Against the State Act and remanded to the Special Criminal Court in Dublin. And there would have been an end completely to the type of circus which they obviously delight in running by coming south for court appearances, and they revelled in it this morning.
For the past 10 months, Northern Ireland's unionist politicians have been trying to think of new ways to keep their campaign of resistance against the Anglo-Irish agreement alive. During the course of that period, some of them have repeatedly tried to get themselves arrested for not paying their television licenses or their car tax. But the British government has clearly decided that that would be too much of a propaganda victory, and they have not been prosecuted north of the border. Yet here, In Dundalk today, they received precisely that propaganda victory.
The border areas near Dundalk have now returned to normal, the secret war against terrorism continuing as the fuss dies down. The IRA constantly threatens attacks on the north. Loyalists have now developed a taste for adventures in the other direction. Both sides in different ways seem determined to show London and Dublin that the Anglo-Irish agreement has not brought its hoped-for improvements to security along their troubled border.
And joining us now from a studio in Dublin is John Kelly, who's a former Attorney General in the Irish Republic. First of all, Mr. Kelly, what do you say to Gavin Esther's concluding point there that perhaps today's events in Dundalk have given the Loyalists a propaganda boost they've never been able to achieve in the north?
No one down here, I think, would look at it like that. I think the average citizen of the Republic would look at this whole stunt as being intended to distract attention from the fact that Mr. Robinson made a thundering ass of himself last week, that he made himself a king-size laughingstock, and with himself, his party and his party's leader, he brought a band of roughnecks over the border last week in order to demonstrate what he thought was defective security on our side of the border, and he ended up behind bars. That requires no commentary from me.
What about the Dundalk councillor we heard from just a few moments ago, who said, however, that perhaps the authorities in the south had mishandled the matter by committing Mr. Robinson to appear in Dundalk and not in Dublin, where such trouble perhaps wouldn't have arisen at all?
Well, you know, once the criminal law comes into play in our country, the very same as in yours, the government is not in the picture at all. Our government, just like your government, cannot control what happens in the courts, and somebody who comes over our border from whatever direction and breaks the law, or whom the police believe has broken the law, is treated in the ordinary way, brought before the local justice and remanded according to the ordinary calendar of court sittings to the next sitting of that court, in wherever it happens to be. That is exactly what was done with Mr. Robinson, and the government couldn't have done anything to change that, and it would have been quite wrong of them to attempt it. Had such an attempt been made for the sake of saving someone's face in the case of a Republican prisoner, I can imagine what Mr. Paisley and Mr. Robinson would have had to say. Now,
nevertheless, Gavin Esther's point really was, to return to it if I may, that the Loyalist community in the north has been trying to achieve the status, if you like, of folk heroes or even martyrs in their opposition to the British-Irish agreement. Is it not possible that today, in a sense, at least in the eyes of their own supporters, whatever people in the Republic may think, they have been given that propaganda bonus?
Well, I find it hard to think myself into the boots of a unionist, let alone a unionist of the kidney that would follow Mr. Robinson or Mr. Paisley. But all I can say is that the sort of behaviour which was seen today was a very obviously contrived and staged stunt. Obviously, if you bring 150 hooligans over a border and advertise a week in advance that they're coming, you will find another 150 hooligans to confront them. And what has happened in the meanwhile today is that 1,000 of our police have been taken away from their ordinary duties, which include patrolling the border against the IRA.
Even advertising, even advertising the arrival in advance of hooligans, as you put it, doesn't surely justify the throwing of petrol bombs out of windows.
Of course it doesn't justify it, but I mean, our police put on, as far as I've been able to judge it, the absolute maximum effort that could be done without causing even more trouble. They were told in advance that this array of roughnecks was arriving. They were unprovocative. They exposed themselves to injury, as they always do on these occasions. The people of Dundalk, and let me remind your audience, because probably many of them have never heard of Dundalk, it's a small town by English standards, but it's a large one by ours. It's got over 12,000 people in it. And only a very, very small section of those 12,000 people interfered in any way whatever with those who arrived today. And of the ones who did interfere with them, I would make a fair bet that a lot of them were natives of the north of Ireland to begin with.
John Kelly, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, in what's become a regular occurrence for the past 8 months, the government announced today that unemployment is up again. The figures for July show the jobless total standing at 3,279,594, up more than 50,000 on the previous month. The seasonally adjusted figure, a guide to the important underlying trend, rose by 4,400. And manufacturing industry has again suffered badly, losing 8,000 jobs. Unemployment has now risen every month since January, But since Parliament went into recess, there's been a series of even more worrying economic indicators suggesting, in the words of the Association of British Chambers of Commerce, that the economic recovery is fizzling out. That view was endorsed by further official figures published today. Industrial output fell in June by 1.2% after a fall of 1.8% in May. Despite a small rise in the latest figures for manufacturing output, production for the second quarter of 1986 is still 1% lower than in the corresponding period last year. The government has, of course, always sought comfort in the rate of inflation, and when the new rate is announced tomorrow, it's likely to fall slightly. Last month, at 2.5%, it was the lowest for almost 20 years. Increasingly, however, ministers are realizing there are pressures in the economy which could force the inflation rate up again. These arise mainly from the continued increase in wage costs. For those in work, times have been good, better in fact than we can afford. Average earnings, it was announced today, showed an 8.1% rise in the year to June, and the underlying increase there remains at 7.5%, 3 times the rate of inflation. John Foster has been examining how this prosperity is itself becoming a headache for the government in employment terms.
Take a look at some parts of the prosperous southeast, and Britain, it seems, is booming. For those in work, the epitaph to the Macmillan years, "You've never had it so good," seems to apply to Mrs. Thatcher's Britain 30 years on. But not everyone is happy.
Hooray, 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 misery's on the way. There are bad times just around the corner. There are dark clouds hurtling through the sky. And it's no good whining about a silver lining, for we know from experience that they won't roll by.
With earnings going up 3 times faster than inflation, it looks like jam today. But the Chancellor hasn't been clapping his hands with glee, and some economists are gloomy too. Among those predicting bread and marge tomorrow is Maurice Peston, a former advisor to Labour governments.
British costs are rising too rapidly, and therefore it's very hard for British industry, notably British manufacturing industry, to compete. And that, I think, is a serious problem for this government, who have, except for exhorting firms and workers not to pay high money wages, have nothing to offer. And this is an extraordinary state of affairs.
Settlements in the current pay round show the extent of the problem. Though lower than 5 years ago, they've stayed stubbornly above the inflation rate. In October last year, the council manual workers agreed an 8.4% rise, setting a marker for the lower paid, which was quickly taken up in the private sector. By December, Rowntree Mackintosh's 6% was typical for those in the food and soft drinks industry. In January, BP2 settled at 6%. Since then, inflation's continued to fall. Pay settlements haven't. February, Rolls-Royce Motors 8%. May, the pharmaceutical company, the Wellcome Foundation, 7.5%. And in June, the computer firm ICL settled on a deal worth 8%. Most other companies have ended up with agreements in the same range. Now, even the economist Samuel Britton, who's been at the forefront of the new market economics, says urgent action is needed.
Well, I'm not going to jump out of my window about it, but it's not something that can continue, clearly. And it can be ended in one of 2 ways. The inflation rate can go up to reduce the gap, or pay rates can come down. And I think that if we let inflation rates go right up again to about 5 or 6%, which would be necessary to bridge that gap, we would be landed with all the old problems quite unnecessarily, and we would be throwing away a golden opportunity. But nevertheless, that's one way in which it can come to an end. The other way in which it can come to an end would be more sense in pay settlements.
The Chancellor appreciates the problem, but industrialists don't seem to care. Settlements far higher than Mr. Lawson would like are being offered on a plate. The worry is that someone's going to have to pay for today's excesses. Increased productivity is generally the much-trumpeted solution, but all too often that's just a euphemism for shedding more jobs. And then today's happy wage earner could be joining tomorrow's dole queue.
Pay settlements are often determined inside firms at a rather low level by people who are not exactly first class, who have got in their minds an idea of 5 or 6 or 7%, which then gets added to by wage drift, and it reaches 8 or even 9%. And this is more than they have to pay, and the people who are doing it are in a muddle. They think that they're being fair to their employees and not realizing they're being desperately unfair to the unemployed.
Pay is a very complex issue, not something that's just negotiated over. It's something which is used to motivate your staff. It's used to attract skills when you're operating in labour markets where there's a shortage of skilled labour. There's a number of considerations that companies have to bear in mind, and that's why I think at the moment pay rates are higher than the rate of inflation.
Be that as it may, those with a pay packet are enjoying the easy money. A year ago, an average family on wages of £220 a week would have had a net income of £167. After an increase of, say, 7.5% in March, the same family would now have £181 net income, an increase of £14. Against that, a family where the parents are out of work would have received £99 a week in benefits this time last year. This has now gone up by just £5 to £104. The gap between rich and poor is widening. And once the pay trend has been set, those in work don't want to lose out.
There is no free labour market. I'm afraid, though, that the government is stuck in the attitudes and controversies of the 1970s, and the opposition parties are stuck in the attitudes of the 1960s. I would like to consider policies appropriate for the late 1980s and the early 90s. I think that they need a big booster in the form not merely of a little piece of sugar, but a bigger piece of sugar, and perhaps some shock treatment for the many companies that are absolutely stuck in their old ways.
What is vital is that the government avoids the temptation of an incomes policy, because an incomes policy would impose costs that far outweigh any potential benefits.
For this government, an incomes policy would be more than a U-turn. It would mean putting its economic policies into a different vehicle on a different road. As it is, people who feel better off because of big pay rises may be tempted to vote Conservative. The dilemma for the Chancellor is that what's bad for Britain may be good for votes.
With me now is the Employment Minister, Kenneth Clarke. Mr. Clarke, does the government accept one of the underlying thrusts of John Foster's report, that there is a direct link between these too high wage increases and the persistent and stubborn levels of unemployment?
I certainly do, because we've got growth in the economy, we've got low inflation, we've got a lot of policies on training and encouraging enterprise, but still the number of new jobs is not enough to get the unemployment figures down. And I agree largely with the analysis we just listened to. That's because pay levels in this country have remained stubbornly high. People are still pricing themselves out of jobs, or more importantly, they're pricing other people out of jobs by those settlements.
But is ministerial exhortation enough to get them to appreciate the changed reality of low inflation?
It's got to be a combination of ministerial exhortation, which is important, I think, coupled with a realisation of self-interest on the part of companies and their trade unions. The fact is, at the moment, we're enjoying low inflation. So are most of our competitors in Western Europe. In the rest of Western Europe, pay settlements have followed that inflation down. Here we're stuck with these absurdly high levels of settlement, even higher levels of earning increases, and then we find that we're losing out on markets and we're losing jobs.
Is there a danger here of a vicious downward spiral in the sense that because our wage increases are higher than those of our competitor countries, we lose productivity, and there may later be a pressure to shed still more labour to recover that lost productivity?
Well, there are two sides to the argument. If you could actually get productivity levels in this country to exceed the productivity improvements in competitor countries, then we could afford higher wage levels. The trouble is, for the kind of productivity improvements we're now getting, which are good compared with our own past performance, we pay ourselves much more than our competitors, whereas they're also making advances. And the way we lose jobs is we have to shed labour to carry those labour costs to keep any sort of position in markets at all. And almost a test of achievement for British management now is the extent to which they can keep down labour costs, shed numbers of people in order to afford the pay increases which our system of pay bargaining forces on them.
Can companies be led, however, to see, as you say, the self-interest in keeping their wage rises for their workforce down without some incentive or penalty, like a tax of some sort on wage increases that go too high above a certain level?
Well, with respect to Sam Britton, I mean, I agree you can't be stuck in the attitudes of the 1970s, but you do need to learn from the lessons of the 1970s. All those tactics in the past of intervening directly with penalties or encouragement to one firm or another did fail. I mean, like most Conservatives, I've supported pay policies myself in the past. Like most Conservatives, I've come to the view they don't work, and in Britain they lead to terrible explosions at the end when you come out of them. That's why we keep finding new ideas, like the consultation on profit sharing, which we're trying at the moment, to try to get some part of the reward of individuals in this country tied more closely to the performance, productivity of their company. If the company earns more, you can be paid more, but you mustn't be paid more if you're not performing particularly well.
Coming back to the other aspect of training and so forth as an effort to make an impact on unemployment, you talked about all the schemes that are present in operation, and yet today the Manpower Services Commission has been saying that in many parts of the country, although there's high unemployment, lots of people, there are jobs going for skilled people which cannot be filled. Now, if that's the case, doesn't it suggest at least that all the training schemes aren't working properly?
It suggests we've got to do a lot more than we already are. The fact is, you need a much more skilled and trained labour force to get jobs in today's industry. Our young people are now better trained, I think, than ever before. YTS, supplementing all the improvements we're making in the school curriculum, the work experience we're giving to school children and so on, that's, I think, producing a much better prepared generation of young people. Adult training, we're now helping the training of 250,000 people by making our schemes more effective than they used to be. But I agree with the MSC, we've got to go on beyond that, and it requires employers as well as the government to make a contribution. In Germany, they do this as a matter of habit. Here, employers have got to say that not only are we going to complain about a lack of skilled people, we're going to have to put more money into training our own, as well as bemoaning the fact that other companies won't train people that we find available on the market.
Finally, Mr. Clark, are you satisfied that without some sort of direct intervention to keep those too high wage increases, to depress these down a bit, that unemployment is going to fall at all?
Well, I'm satisfied that we have over 1 million extra jobs now compared with 3 years ago. Disappointed that even those extra jobs don't keep up with the rising number of people looking for work. The fact is, we're all agreed we have to do more, so long as people will take the message about what more we have to do. More training, more encouragement for new business, and more sensible pay bargaining. An end to the going rate and national pay bargaining. Let's tie an individual's pay to the performance of his company and the productivity of improvements it achieves.
Kenneth Clark, thanks very much indeed. The continuing political troubles in Pakistan have turned to violence once again. The toll tonight stands at 5 killed. And Benazir Bhutto, who defied a government ban to lead a rally of her supporters today, is under arrest. Ms. Bhutto's detention follows yesterday's crackdown by General Zia's government on the opposition parties, which led to more arrests and violent confrontation with the authorities today, Independence Day. All was sweetness and light this evening on Pakistan television, which concentrated instead on the Independence Day celebrations. Significantly, General Zia allowed the Prime Minister of his carefully constructed civilian government to take a leading role in the day's proceedings. He had called off a rally of his own supporters, but the real crowds were anyway elsewhere today. Benazir Bhutto stood at the head of thousands of her followers, who demonstrated in Karachi and in Lahore, as George Arnay now reports.
Benazir Bhutto braved tear gas attacks for 40 minutes on her way to address a crowd of some 20,000 people who gathered in Karachi despite a government banning order. 2 tear gas shells even hit her jeep. She says that the government has taken off its mask of democracy and has presented its real face, a face of authoritarianism and repression. Now she's being held in a government rest house about 40 miles away from Karachi. There was a lot of brutality about today's police action. One colleague saw a young boy being beaten up by 6 policemen. His offence was to be wearing a People's Party badge. I too saw police striking out viciously and needlessly as they chased bystanders down the back alleys in the old city of Lahore. 4 people were killed when police opened fire. Not even during the martial law years were there such deaths here, and reliable eyewitnesses say it was unprovoked. But it was also noticeable, as tear gas drifted through the air, that only half a mile away from where the shootings took place, kites were being flown to celebrate Independence Day. And hordes of middle-class families have been out on the streets enjoying themselves tonight as if nothing at all had happened.
When she returned to Pakistan 4 months ago to test democracy, as she put it, Benazir Bhutto was assured by the authorities that she would be free to attend rallies and address meetings. But Ms. Bhutto was openly sceptical about the government's assurances. 2 days before she left London to go back to Pakistan, she told Newsnight she was worried about how her supporters would react if she was arrested or anything were to happen to her.
I think that in the present mood, if the regime were to do anything to me, there'd be a terrible law and order situation in the country, especially if they were to take my life, because the crowd is in a very happy mood, it's in a very excited mood, a hopeful mood, and if it turns into anger and grief, then it could be very negative.
After Ms. Bhutto's arrest, I spoke to Nasir Shah, her chief party spokesman, at her home in Karachi. I asked Mr. Shah what he knew about his leader's whereabouts.
She has been put under arrest, and we were told that she will be taken to central jail. But till this moment, we have not known where she has been kept.
What effect do you think this new arrest of Ms. Bhutto will have on her supporters and on the People's Party?
I think there was a lot of reaction. You know, people were already on the streets, and it will be very difficult for the administration to control the situation now, although she has asked everybody to be peaceful.
Ever since Benazir Bhutto went back to Pakistan, she's been engaged in a dangerous game of brinkmanship with President Zia. The president has in fact been out of the country this week. He's in Saudi Arabia on an annual pilgrimage. But it's the first time he's missed the country's independence celebrations. And this has led to speculation that the president's absence might enable him to disclaim responsibility for this week's crackdown on the opposition. Well, Nasim Ahmed, as someone who served as a minister under the late President Bhutto, what do you think the attitude of President Zia is to all this, knowing as we do that he's out of the country actually at the moment?
Well, General Zia may be out of the country, but he is very much in control of the situation. He is in regular touch through the hotline. And you must remember that Sindh is under a governor who is general, the only province of Pakistan where a general still is retained as governor. So they have got very tight control. And the thing is that he tried to arrest Ms. Bhutto, or was thinking of arresting Ms. Bhutto, previous occasions also after her return. But this time I think they have taken the action because they find that her popularity is growing and the challenge she poses has become very strong.
Well, also with me is Nasim Ahmed, who is Alex Brody, who's recently returned from a tour of duty as BBC correspondent in Pakistan. What do you think President Zia is up to?
Playing his usual very clever game. Zia is, of course, in control. He's out of the country. His government, led by Prime Minister Junaid, is actually dispensable. This could be seen, if there is violence on the streets, as warring politicians once again making a mess of things. The general can sit back and say, look, I told you so. Politicians always mess it up. It's time for a strong hand. We have to step in again. That scenario, everybody knows in Pakistan, that scenario is possible, and that's what everybody fears.
Do you think that's in the president's mind?
Well, if he does that, he will shoot himself on the foot, you see, because already there is criticism from Washington, and I don't think the Western democracies that have been supporting him, chiefly on account of Afghanistan, are going to put up with another martial law repression. And that is not only going to play havoc inside Pakistan, I am afraid it is going to play havoc with the interests of the free world, so to say, in our part of the globe.
Alex, as far as Benazir Bhutto's motives are concerned, but she must have known that she was courting arrest and this kind of danger. What's been going on in her mind?
Well, I think she's in a no-win situation, but she can't lose either. They lock her up. She can say, well, look, this democracy is a sham. I come home, you say we can have open politics. You lock me up. It's a sham. So on that side, she wins in the long run. She's only 33. There's plenty of time. And on the other hand, there is trouble on the streets. everything gets suspended, as I think will happen if it gets out of hand. This so-called process to democracy gets suspended, and we have to wait a little longer. I think that the stakes in Pakistan are so high. It is the front line against communism, official Washington policy. There is Afghanistan and the Red Army on the other side of the border. Pakistan, a stable Pakistan, is the most important thing to Washington. I don't think they're going to worry too much if it's dressed up properly, if there's some form of clampdown again.
Well, you say that Ms. Bhutto has got plenty of time, but isn't she in considerable personal danger now?
Yes, I think she is. Less danger, probably, if she's actually in jail and the authorities are responsible for her. The popularity is the popularity, I think, very much of Bhuttoism. There's a general assumption in Pakistan that the shroud of Mr. Bhutto, the hanged Prime Minister, will mean there will be another Bhutto government sometime. That is inevitable. People assume that is inevitable. If Benazir Bhutto was removed from the scene, who knows?
Might she be?
Well, there is always the danger that, after all, General Zia hanged Ms. Bhutto's father, and anything can be expected of him. But I do not think imposition of martial law is going to bring stability to the country at all. It is going to actually negative all that General Zia has been trying to do. And already there is a strong opinion in the Congress, in the United States Congress. And the human rights record of the previous martial law regime was very bad indeed. And I don't think he will be able to get away with it, internally or internationally.
Is there any ground for an accommodation, whatever, between Ms. Bhutto and President Zia, or does one of them have to go?
One of them has to go. I don't think there's any likelihood that there can be accommodation. There can be an accommodation between just about anybody else, but not between General Zia and Benazir Bhutto.
Finally, do you accept his analysis that a military clampdown again is the most likely situation?
But the question is, if he has military clampdown, he is again going to damage himself in his own process. But there is, I agree that there can be no accommodation between a despot and somebody who is aspiring for democracy through peaceful change.
Naseem Ahmed and Alex Brody, thank you both very much indeed. Now, Jenny.
Tonight, President Reagan faces the almost certain prospect of a serious reverse in his policy towards South Africa. The US Senate are now debating a bill to impose sanctions on South Africa and have already voted to strengthen the proposed measures in defiance of their president's wishes. Only last night, the president was celebrating a hard-won victory in his running battle with Congress over foreign policy, when the Senate narrowly approved his request for £100 million of aid for the Contra rebels in Nicaragua. Tonight, the tables are turned. Already, an amendment proposed by Senator Alan Cranston to add a ban on textile imports to the sanctions bill has been approved by a two-thirds majority. Senator Richard Lugar, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee and architect of the limited sanctions bill under debate, pleaded that our leverage must be applied with wisdom. His sanctions proposals include a ban on new US investment in South Africa and a ban on new bank loans, a ban on American imports of uranium and coal, and a withdrawal of South African Airways' rights to land in America. The Senate plans to move to a vote by tomorrow, and the bill appears to have the support of both parties, although there are about 80 more amendments to discuss. If it goes through, as seems likely, a consensus still has to be reached with the House of Representatives, which has already approved a much stronger package of sanctions. But there is a suggestion that the President may stick to his guns and use his power of veto if there's less than a two-thirds majority. Well, today, the black American civil rights leader, Jesse Jackson, passed through London on his way to Africa, where he'll be discussing apartheid with black African leaders. Donald asked him whether he thought the Senate vote would go against President Reagan.
I think so, only because it's becoming an election issue for November. Now senators are having to go back home and explain linkage between their getting vote from the American people and their moral resolve relative to apartheid in South Africa. Clearly, public pressure is growing. I must say that the Eminent Persons Group report here in Britain has had some tremendous impact upon the American public, perhaps even more so than the Royal Court opinions. The kind of leadership that Senator Rampal has given to this situation throughout the Commonwealth, and Sir Lyndon Penland was felt substantially in America.
Do you think that President Reagan is at all likely ever to change his mind about South Africa when he's been saying so recently, for example, that the African National Congress is an organization shot through with communists?
You must not forget, he took that same position relative to supporting Marcos even in the elections until 1 minute before midnight. But when the will of the people prevailed anyhow, he made a rather radical shift and tried to take credit for getting Marcos out and getting Mrs. Aquino in. So the Filipino people are essentially enjoying self-determination today, not because of Mr. Reagan, but in spite of him. My reading is the same thing will happen in South Africa.
Do you think there's any chance that the president might veto the Senate's moves?
If he vetoes it, it will not stem the struggle in South Africa. It will stimulate it. And it will expose him, and in some sense, the gap between him and the American public. But clearly, if the U.S. House and Senate and the American public is moving toward a new formula for Southern Africa, for sanctions as a strategy to stop apartheid, moving toward humane aid and trade and development and defense. And he's over here vetoing the sanctions, therefore aligning himself with Botha in that instance. Clearly, he cannot win either way he goes on that.
Isn't it a fact, however, that President Botha only this week has been making it very plain that whatever people outside South Africa may wish, he intends inside his own country to proceed at his own pace?
Well, his pace will not be the final determination of liberation. There is another pace. The people in South Africa, the majority are marching to the beat of a different drummer. His sticks are not determining the rhythm anymore. The will to be free is of such until people are willing to suffer the crucifixion to get the resurrection. They're willing to survive the hardship and the pain. They're willing to choose emancipation over employment and dollars, dignity over dollars. It is that resolve to be free that defies the arrogance of Botha. And therefore, it becomes the interest of America, who is South Africa's #1 trading partner, and Britain, South Africa's #1 investor, to make a morally correct and cost-efficient decision.
Reverend Jesse Jackson, and now today's other news. In Cyprus, police have arrested a man carrying a suitcase of hand grenades amid speculation that he's connected with the attack on the British base at Akrotiri on August the 3rd. The man, who had a Lebanese passport, arrived on the island 2 weeks ago. Bishop Desmond Tutu has been warned that his support for sanctions borders on treason. However, the advice from the government minister Peter du Plessis was described as friendly. President Botha, according to a Supreme Court ruling in Pietermaritzburg, is acting within his powers in arresting and detaining people under the emergency laws. This appears to reverse an earlier ruling in Durban, and it's a setback to the lawyers of hundreds of detainees hoping for an early release. A definitive ruling is expected next week. In Christian East Beirut, a car bomb blew up in a busy shopping area and killed 20 people. 100 others were injured. The explosion, the 19th in the city this year, brings the death toll to more than 160. In Stade, near Hamburg, West German police have arrested 2 Sri Lankan Tamils in connection with the refugees found off the coast of Canada. Television pictures of the refugees shown in Germany have prompted a number of identifications by people living and working in the German refugee camps. The police in Dublin put on show a cache of arms which had been intercepted at the city's sorting office before they could be delivered to the IRA. The weapons had been dispatched from Chicago and included a machine gun accurate to 2,000 yards and 12 pistols. 2 men found at the addresses on the parcels were released after questioning. The official report into allegations against Mr. John Stalker, the suspended Deputy Chief Constable of Greater Manchester, say he was not the victim of a smear campaign in connection with his work in Northern Ireland. Earlier this year, he was taken off an inquiry into the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which had been accused of operating a shoot-to-kill policy. The 1,500-page report has now gone to the Greater Manchester Police Authority for consideration.
And we specifically asked Mr. Sampson, our investigating officer, to look into these matters. There's no evidence that there was anything fed in from Northern Ireland with a view to discrediting Mr. Stalker.
The actress and Hungarian celebrity Zsa Zsa Gabor has married for the 8th time, or 9th, depending on your viewpoint. She proposed to her first husband when she was 16 or 15, depending on whom you believe. The actor George Sanders, her third husband, was the only one she liked, apparently. Even so, the marriage ended in divorce after 5 years. After Sanders was Conrad Hilton of Hilton Hotels. He was the father of their daughter, Francesca. That marriage lasted 4 years. There was also a businessman, then an oil tycoon, followed by the inventor of the Barbie doll and a lawyer. All my husbands, she says, were tall and grey-haired like my father, and all nasty. Despite the number of trips down the aisle, Miss Gabor has spent at least 20 of the last 47 years separated. The next marriage to a Spanish nobleman is one she doesn't recognise. It was arranged by friends to cheer her up. Her last marriage to a 45-year-old German aristocrat called Prince Frederick von Anhalt seems realistically no more likely to last than the rest, because, according to Miss Gabor, I don't learn lessons, I learn scripts. Well, the honeymoon certainly won't last long. Miss Gabor is to start work on a film about Johann Strauss. Donald.
And a quick look at some of tomorrow morning's front pages. The Guardian has a story about that the government, in an attempt to prevent the publication of a book in Australia, has in effect admitted that several claims about MI5 are true, including the claim that Sir Roger Hollis, former head of MI5, was a Soviet spy. The rest of the papers share the honours between the unemployment story and today's events in Dundalk. The Times has that, and so does the Daily Telegraph. Well, that's all from us for tonight. Jenny and I will be back again tomorrow at 10:50. Please join us once again then. Till then, from all of us, a very good night to you. Good night.